Hey guys, welcome to the Student Side Hustle. So in this show, what we're trying to do is I'm trying to share stories of individuals and people who generally are doing something unique, doing something entrepreneurial, doing something that they're passionate about and trying to make it their career. That's not necessarily the thing that allows you to be on the show or qualifies you to be a guest on the show, but that's generally what we're talking about. We're talking about entrepreneurship, passion, etc. A lot of it revolves around bodybuilding and fitness because that's what I'm personally interested in. But what I want you to take away from this is just the fact that you can do whichever passion that you'd like to do, and you can make that into a career. It's a long path, but you can make it happen. And basically what I'm doing is showing you 80 plus examples of people who are doing it and who have done it. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I would love if you would subscribe because we've got a lot of new episodes coming out. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.
People are constantly raising the bar.
Sacrifices need to be made.
What would you guys say are your biggest weaknesses?
You are your enemy right now.
It's success or die.
Just a fucking podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to the Student Side Hustle. This week I'm speaking to Jackson Peos. So Jackson is a PhD candidate in nutrition at the University of Western Australia, and he is also a nutrition coach. Jackson, how did you get into doing all this sort of stuff, and then how did the idea for your recent paper come about, and then how did that sort of pan out?
Sure, man. Thanks for having me on the podcast, by the way.
No worries.
So sort of as a kid, I was very heavily involved in sports. I played football, I was a rower, and got to a decently high level with those sort of things. And sort of around the age of 15, 16 was when I started lifting weights. But that was always sort of just to complement the sporting stuff. And so I always had a big passion in sport. But as I was sort of finishing up in school, doing my final year exams and whatnot, deciding what sort of university degrees and things to pursue, I ended up going into a veterinary science degree. And it sort of sounds silly now, but the only really reason that I went for that degree is because it was the hardest degree to get into in our state, and I was a sort of competitive sort of guy, so I just wanted to push myself in that way. Right. So I started doing a veterinary science degree, and in my first year, one of my elective units, which is sort of just one of the side units that you do to complement your core units, was this first year sports science degree. And sort of a couple months in, I was sort of figuring out that I was putting more effort into the sports science degree than I was, the sports science unit than I was to sort of my core veterinary science units. And so I thought, fuck, this is probably not a good idea for me to follow this degree. So I ended up changing and moving to UWA. Parents freaked out a bit because they thought I lost my marbles and their vet child was now going to be a PE teacher or something. But anyway, so I started with a Bachelor of Science in Sports Science and double majored with exercise and health. And as soon as I started, I loved it. And I found it quite easy, and I did quite well with the results. And those results sort of earned me a couple of scholarships down the track, which allowed me to do my honours degree in exercise physiology. And that's when I really started getting introduced to the sort of the nutritional programming for athletes and how you can structure some of the dietary stuff to optimize performance. And that's what I was really, really keen on. So I graduated with first class honours in that degree. That was my postgrad degree. And because I did well there, the university offered me a scholarship to complete my PhD the year later. That's where I am now. And so sort of when you earn a PhD or you get offered a place, you have a couple of supervisors and you sit down and you talk about some of the sort of projects that you're interested in. And at the time, still am, I was very interested in not only optimizing sports performance through the nutritional side of things, but also how you can optimize physique development through nutrition. And so I was sort of thinking to myself, okay, what are some of the things that people are using? What's some of the nutritional things that physique athletes are using today that probably haven't really been validated in the research or the literature just yet? And the two things I was sort of thinking about were reverse dieting or slash recovery dieting, which your viewers will probably know about. And now the other thing was refeeds and diet breaks.
Yeah.
Like every man and his dog starting a diet talks about how great these refeeds and diet breaks are. But when you actually have a good hard look at the research, you realize that there's actually pretty low grade evidence to support these things. Like a lot of athletes and coaches, they think they work, but we don't really know for sure because these things just haven't been tested yet. So long story short, that's what led me into my research now. And my current PhD studies are comparing your continuous traditional style of dieting versus an intermittent style of dieting, which encompasses refeeds and diet breaks, and specifically how it ties into athlete performance and physique development.
Right, and I believe you just published a paper regarding this. And how did that pan out? What were the original sort of results of this?
Right, so the way so originally I got hooked in with Eric Helms, and he was great because he gave me a lot of advice about sort of how you should set up a PhD, what you want to get out of it, and things like that. And I told him some of the things that I wanted to research, and he was like, "Hell yeah, man! Like, I'd be keen to help out with that." And we were sort of talking about the study that we wanted to do and how we were going to do it, and what sort of people we wanted, how we wanted to set up the diet break sort of regimen or the refeed regimen. We're talking about all these sort of things, and we sort of just said, fuck, there's so much variation with refeeds and diet breaks out there. Can we put together a paper, not a scientific study, but a review paper where we go and collect all the different research out there that compares intermittent diets, so diets with refeeds and diet breaks versus your traditional diet? Can we go collect all that research, compare that, and sort of can we get some consensus on what we know about these things just yet? And can we make some practical recommendations for an athlete who's considering doing an intermittent style diet? So it was me, Eric, Dr. Andy Galpin, and Dr. Lane Norton. We all got together and we all looked hard at the research. We gathered all the different studies that we could collect, and we just reviewed everything, and then we concluded. We gathered all the research and we said, okay, what are the conclusions that we can make of this? And the biggest conclusion was, well, we don't really know as much about refeeds and diet breaks that we think we know. Like there are some studies that give evidence for an intermittent style diet that may be superior to a continuous diet, but the evidence grade is quite low. And the evidence grade is low because what happens with a lot of nutritional research is it typically is biased towards overweight and obese populations. Right. And the reason for that is because it is very easy to get funding for those sort of studies. Yeah. It is extremely difficult to get funding for a study where you're telling sort of the board or the grants committee that you want to run a study to help athletes sort of get more shredded and be more jacked. Like that in terms of like world, that sort of world importance. It's on a different scale towards of treating disease and things like that. Like that's obesity that's causing premature mortality and things like that. So a lot of the research that's compared intermittent diets has been on overweight people, and the problem with that is we know that overweight people have completely different sort of physiological profiles to sort of healthy weight athletes who typically have really high physical activity energy expenditures, and they don't really have any preliminary states of diseases that overweight and obese people might have. And we know that they just respond to things a little bit differently. Like one key example is when you start dieting an overweight person, typically they will have no reduction in lean body mass, like nothing whatsoever. Whereas if you take an athlete who's already at 10% body fat, you start dieting them down, the proportion of weight that is lost, that is lean mass, is actually quite significant. So we already know that there needs to be different considerations for nutritional setup for an overweight versus a overweight person versus a lean athlete. And another key good example just to support this is when you take a lean athlete who's 10% body fat and you start dieting them down, you usually see significant reductions in sort of many hormonal profiles, but specifically testosterone goes down. And you can see that in a lot of good research with physique athletes who get to those like nasty low levels of body fat. You can start seeing they go hypogonadal sometimes.
Yes.
We're talking outside physiological range.
Right.
Whereas you take an overweight person, you start dieting them down, sometimes their testosterone actually goes up. So
right.
Like,
so they're getting into more. Would you say that would be possibly a result of them getting into a healthy range, whereas the bodybuilder is almost getting outside of a healthy range?
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right.
So just with those two examples, we know that like we can't look at nutritional research and overweight people and go, okay, we saw this finding, so that means that's going to happen in lean athletes as well. We can't say that. So that's why we sort of did the review paper, and that's why what led me to sort of when I started to set up my diet break study, we're like, okay, we're going to do this in lean training athletes because it hasn't been done before. There's been one single study that has tested some sort of intermittent diet with lean athletes, and it hasn't even been published yet. It's only the conference findings have only just been released, and it was at USF run by Bill Campbell, and he tested a 5-day diet followed by a 2-day refeed versus just a 7-day diet protocol.
Right.
And they saw that the group refeeding sort of maintain their metabolic rate to a higher degree than the continuous dieting group.
Right.
And they better maintain their lean mass than the continuous group as well. But other than that, we don't really have any research. So when I started my PhD, we had none. We had nothing on lean athletes in terms of refeeds or diet breaks.
So now we only have one.
We have one, yeah.
Wow.
And so my one is going to be the second. And it's funny, right? Because people will be like, oh, yeah, refeeds are very scientific and we have a lot of good evidence. we don't have anything really.
Yeah.
We have a pretty sound theoretical rationale of like why we might think they might work. But apart from like conclusive RCTs and things like that, we don't have them yet.
We don't have more with a large population. We don't have any sort of, well, barely anything to go off. We're just sort of
not at all, man.
almost guessing.
Yeah, we have stuff on overweight people, we have stuff on rats, and we have one study on training athletes. So,
That's something that's quite surprising to me because it's like, especially nowadays, they are so widely used, and it's like pretty much every reputable coach I know is like, yeah, you should probably refeed. Yeah. Do you think they're almost unapplicable to the average person? Because, like, say if you're not going for bodybuilding level lean or anywhere near that, do you think refeeds could be applicable? For instance, say if you're going from 30% to 15%.
That's a good question. I'll caveat it by saying that I think refeeds and diet breaks have potentially more benefit for a lean person than a person who's starting at 30%, like you said. And some of those reasons, what I touched on before, is we know that a lean person is more susceptible to lean mass losses as they get lower body fat. So with that in mind, it's possible that sort of a temporary upsurge in calories might activate provide a temporary anabolic stimulus or anti-catabolic stimulus that might help a person in that sort of state.
Would this be some things similar to like one maintaining lean body mass, but would that be through doing something? I would like to get into how refeeds work after this, but would that be one way? Would that be through keeping testosterone at a higher level?
One way. So we know that when you give someone a big surge of calories, you start getting a little bit of restoration of hormonal profiles. And the ones that we care most about is testosterone, which sort of your anabolic hormones as your IGF and your testosterone.
Yeah.
Your hunger regulating hormones, which are leptin and ghrelin. And it's also your thyroid profiles as well. So we know we haven't really seen it in control feeding studies, but we've seen it in overfeeding studies where you're giving someone a caloric surplus.
Right.
You start seeing this boost in leptin, and we know that leptin is a hormone that not only makes you feel satiated and full while after meals and whatnot, but it also has a positive effect on energy expenditure, on metabolism. So in theory, if you can boost leptin, the science would suggest that you're going to feel less hungry, and you're potentially going to be burning more calories at rest, which is going to make the weight loss a little bit more efficient, and probably is going to make adherence a little bit easier because you're not so starving all the time. And we see the same thing with thyroid, like our active forms of thyroid, T3 and T4. They tend to restore when you start giving someone a whole lot of calories, and we know that thyroid is is a strong predictor of energy expenditure, how many calories you're burning throughout the day. So if we can have higher levels of these things, we're potentially going to be burning more calories,
right,
and things like that. So the idea is that if we can maintain a metabolic rate or a resting energy expenditure at a higher level, it's going to make the dieting phase a lot more efficient and a lot more successful. The more your metabolism goes down and the less calories you burn at rest means you're just going to have to widen the energy deficit later on by either increasing activity or decreasing your caloric intake, both things which you don't want to have to, you don't want to have to push them super far.
Would this be a fair statement? If you're applying refeeds versus not applying refeeds, would you say you could be at a higher metabolic rate if you are applying refeeds at the end of, if you end up at the same place, same body fat percentage, or maybe same weight, I'm not sure what the right metric would be to use there, using refeeds, would you be more likely to be able to have more food by the end of your cut?
Yes. So that's pretty much exactly what we saw with Bill Campbell's study at USF. So they had the same energy deficit, but they lost more fat and they maintained their energy. They maintained their metabolism or the resting energy expenditure at a higher level than the continuous group. Yeah. We've also seen another study by Davudi, where what they did is, this was in overweight women, so take that as what you will, but it was essentially an 8-week diet. One of the groups dieted consistently for 8 weeks, so that would be a continuous traditional group. Yeah. Then we had this other group where they dieted, so they dieted for 11 days in a row, and then for 3 days they had a 3-day refeed where they just ate what they liked. Now, the group who was doing these 3-day refeeds every 2 weeks, they were eating a lot more food than the continuous group, right? Because they had those 3-day refeeds. Yeah. But they lost just as much fat. Yeah. So that's, in answer to what your question, sometimes it might happen. Like, you might be able to lose just as much weight by eating more food, or eating the same amount of food as a continuous group but losing more fat. Like, we do have some evidence that might happen.
Right. This is quite interesting to me, because it's like the whole, it's almost counterintuitive when you first sort of think about it. Would you be able to basically explain what you think is a decent approach to a refeed, and sort of what, say, if you give example calories, obviously it can't apply to everyone, because, I could be eating 3,000, someone could be eating 5,000, whatever. And then after that, we'll go into the physiological sort of what is actually happening and why we would apply this and when.
Okay. That's a loaded question. I'll just start with the first thing, and you can just sort of push me along. Yeah. So there's two ways we can, in terms of your intermittent diet, that we have two pathways we can go down. One is your refeed, one is your diet break. A refeed typically involves sort of 24 to 72 hour increase in calories somewhere intermittently dispersed throughout the diet phase. Right. So that's more of your short-term increase in calories.
Would that be somewhere towards maintenance?
Yes. So it's probably not a good idea to overfeed during these times. So gain weight, because if you're gaining weight, it's the fat that you're going to have to then lose in the following consecutive dieting days is probably going to it's going to outweigh the potential benefits of the refeed itself.
So are you trying to stay at the same weight potentially?
Correct. It's in an ideal situation, you want to be maintaining your body weight. So there's a couple of ways you can do that, but in my study, what we do. Sorry, I'll finish what I was going to say with the refeeds. So your refeed is your short-term sort of 1 to 3 days caloric boost. Now, on the other hand, you've got a diet break, which tends to be sort of 7 days to 14 days caloric increase. Yep. So it's a longer-term thing. Now, we had a recent study which was published by one of my supervisors, where they took a group of people and they gave one group a 16-week continuous diet. And the other group, which was our intermittent diet break group, after every 2 weeks of dieting, they did a 2-week diet break. Right. And we saw much better fat loss outcomes and maintenance of energy expenditure in the group that was doing the 2-week diet breaks after every 2-week dieting. Right. So
they would almost be 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off.
Yeah, so they still did 16 dieting weeks. They just broke it up by having 2-week diet breaks.
Right, so then effectively the dieting process was longer, but...
Correct. And that's which was one of the challenges when I was setting up my diet break study. Yeah. Was, okay, let's think about athletes in real world sports athletes, physique athletes. Physique athletes are a little bit different because they have a little bit more luxury. Like they might, like a high level pro bodybuilder, specifically a natural bodybuilder, they might only compete once every 3 years. Sports athletes don't get that luxury. They're competing every 6 months to sort of at least every year. Like that, it's yeah. So when you've got a weight loss phase for an athlete, they might not have the luxury of doing sort of a 30-week sort of intervention. So what I thought, which was how long the 2-week on, 2-week off intervention was. So when we were planning out my diet break study, we thought, right, could the same benefits of sort of increased fat loss efficiency and better maintenance of metabolic rate, could we still achieve that if the diet breaks were not as long and not as frequent, because that would sort of effectively shorten the total intervention length. So what we did, so instead of a 2-week on, 2-week off, we said, okay, we're going to diet our athletes for 3 weeks in a row, and then we're going to do just a 1-week diet break. And that's currently the study that I'm running right now. I was just in the lab this morning. So it's going to be, we're going to do 3 blocks of that. So essentially it's 12 dieting weeks with 3 weeks of diet breaks intermittently dispersed throughout.
Right. And then would the goal... Would the goal of this study be sort of to solidify the effectiveness of this, or solidify sort of?
Yeah, I wouldn't say solidify. We probably still need a little bit more research.
Yep.
But we know that diet breaks, the 2-week on, 2-week off method, we know that they're better than a continuous method.
Yeah.
Now we know that there's a lot of limitations to that study, because that study was on overweight people, and we know that it was a very long intervention length, and so it's not that applicable to athletes. So this will be the first time we're testing diet breaks in athletes, and so what we're hoping to find is, okay, number one, that diet breaks work. And that the results that we're seeing in sort of the animal models and the overweight models, they're probably going to be applicable to athletes as well. And what I'm hoping to see is they actually might be more applicable to athletes than overweight people, just because some of those things I talked about before.
Yes. Yeah. And then what about, one thing I would like to touch on is when we're comparing the two for the sort of casual dieter or even the pro level bodybuilder dieter, which do you think would be, and also in which context do you think either or works when we're comparing refeeds and diet breaks? Which one would be, is one obviously better than the other, or is it sort of depends on the context, or?
Good question. It's definitely not obvious. I'd say that the refeed, like with a bodybuilder who has a hard end date, they've got a certain amount of body fat that they need to lose before show date. So sometimes you don't have a luxury of dropping in a 1-week, 2-week diet break, like somewhere in there where you just maintain weight for 2 weeks. Like you don't, because then all of a sudden you're 4 weeks out and you've got a whole lot of fat to lose. Like diet breaks aren't going to ramp up the metabolism so much that those last 4 weeks you're just going to be like shredding fat like no one's business. Like that's not going to happen. Like it's a boost, it's a temporary boost, but it's not. Like it's not gonna double the fat you lose in the next week or something like that outrageously. So that's when sometimes like a 2-day refeed might be a little better for the bodybuilding athlete, because short term it's potentially going to give a little restoration of some of the hormonal downregulation, some of the metabolic downregulation that's been happening from the diet phase itself, and it's also we can probably almost say it's definitely going to provide a psychological benefit to the athlete, because it gives them a little reward for nailing the diet days leading previous. It might give them a little mental refresher. It's probably going to fill out a little bit more glycogen. It's going to allow them to train harder in the gym for a couple more days. So it's probably going to give them a psychological edge. So I think refeeds for the bodybuilder can sometimes be helpful because they're a little bit more short term, and sometimes they don't have the luxury of going through a 2-week weight maintenance phase.
Right. Yeah.
But sometimes bodybuilders, if you planned your prep correctly and you sort of started 30 weeks out, then you might be able to put in some diet breaks. And if you're asking my personal opinion, just looking at some of the research, I think that diet breaks probably have more benefit than just your short-term refeeds. Because what we know about sort of adaptation to an energy deficit, we know that some of the adaptations are very persistent and they're not easily counteracted. So what I mean by that is you can't just give someone an extra 150 grams of carbohydrates for 2 days in a row and expect all this sort of restoration of hormonal profiles and sort of, yes, satiety is going to go back to normal and metabolism is going to come back to where it was pre-diet. Like that's just not going to happen. Like we've seen some data on like physique athletes where you haven't seen restored hormonal profiles until 16 weeks post-show. And that's from a caloric increase and a decrease in activity. So what I'm thinking is that because diet breaks are for a longer term, you're actually putting the person into energy balance, which is sort of just enough calories to maintain their weight, not in an energy deficit. You're taking away the energy deficit signal for a decent amount of time. And I think that the system might go, okay, we're not so deprived right now. We might be able to just turn back the clock on some of these negative adaptations that are going on. Right. And I'm not convinced that a 1 day or 2 day refeed is enough of a stimulus to cause restoration in some of the things that we're trying to turn back.
Right. And then one thing, I know we don't want to get too much into training here, but one thing that I've personally always wondered is, do you personally think, or do you think, does the research show, how do you interact when we're talking deloads, refeeds, diet breaks? How do those interact? Should you try and time a deload and a refeed together? Is that beneficial from what you know, or just anecdotally? Because I think is it sort of like you accumulate fatigue and then try drop a lot of it, or
we had a good discussion about this, like myself and the authors on the review paper, and we actually decided to go another way with it. And what we sort of thought is that the refeeds or diet breaks should actually probably be coordinated with sort of your higher volume weeks or your higher volume blocks, as opposed to your lower volume, lower intensity blocks. And
so
and
for
the
instance,
reason
maybe just before a deload.
Yeah, exactly. That would probably be a decent way to do it.
Yeah.
And another time we probably want to coordinate them is sort of what we call like an outcome focused block, and that would mean sort of a practical example of that would be like a testing week or something like that, because what we know is that when someone diets, we're getting this sort of incremental rise in fatigue, and eventually the fatigue outweighs the fitness, and it's not giving us a true indication of sort of where the athlete is sort of performing. Now, what we can do is we can give them a refeed or a diet break. Fatigue is going to come down a little, and it's going to give us a better idea of where fitness is truly sitting, and it gives a better idea of where the athlete is going to perform at. So this has probably got a little bit more application to sports athletes, because like sprinters and things like that, like you don't want to do a testing week when they're calorically deprived, because it's not going to give a true glycogen depleted, because it's not going to give a true idea of sort of where their PRs are sitting. But what you can do is with a refeed or diet break, restore some glycogen. It's going to allow the athlete to recover better, perform harder, and probably tolerate some higher volumes. And we know that when an athlete has higher sort of saturation of muscle glycogen, their endurance is better and their strength is better. So it would make sense that if you're either going to do testing, do it in a glycogen saturated state. And if you're going to do a higher volume week, probably do it when the calories are a bit higher, because they're going to be able to recover from that work, and they're going to be able to tolerate the high volume.
Right. I think that's something that I've always wondered about, because I think it's very... Is something, the whole thing with glycogen, all that, I think a lot of people will think about it in a weird way. They'll think, okay, I'm going to have 2 Gatorades 1 hour before my workout. Is that sort of BS pretty much? Or do you think trying to...
We're touching on a nutrient timing debate here. I think that we've got a benefit of loading carbohydrates around the workout, particularly if you're going into a longer session, sort of 2 hours plus, and you're probably also going to be wanting to push in some intra-workout carbohydrates and things with a session like that. But I think the most of the benefits sort of, if you're doing a refeed, you sort of want to load the 2 days of carbohydrates and then sort of test the day after, something like that. So you're actually getting the carbohydrates.
So you've already had the intake. Would that sort of be for anyone pretty much, unless it's restrained by weight? Would you really say, if you're doing something on the Wednesday, you'd start loading on the Monday? Or
that's how I'd do it.
Yeah. And would it be a waste, or would it be not as useful to start earlier than that, or is that the general sort of Like, say, for instance, if you're just messing around and you want to try and hit a PR on bench, but weight is irrelevant, and you basically want to load up with glycogen as much as possible, would it be best to load on the Monday if you're doing it on the Wednesday?
If you're going for maximum strength, I'd be loading Monday, Tuesday, and then be loading pre-session on the Wednesday.
Right.
Yeah. If you've got the luxury where sort of you don't have a hard end date where you need to make weight for something, then that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Then like diet breaks are a little bit different because, like I said before, they're a minimum of a week long. So the timing's sort of not that irrelevant because you're going to be having high caloric intake every day for sort of 7 days at least.
And you wouldn't really and throughout, no matter what sort of diet break you're doing, generally the fundamental purpose is always just maintain. You're never going to you're not trying to push up at all during that period.
No, you what you want to do is sort of maintain this thing called energy balance, which is sort of a floating figure. Like it's very hard to nail it right on the money. Like what I'm doing with our diet break study at the moment is when I prescribe diet breaks, we're prescribing the caloric numbers based on predicted maintenance, based on how much weight they've lost in the previous weeks and things like that. But like it's hard to nail it to the calorie to even within 5% calories. Like sometimes we do see a little weight jump. Sometimes we see a little weight lost. But if we average it out from our 60 athletes that we've got coming through the study, it's the group average is going to be sitting around weight stable. So it's
hard to nail, but
it's hard to nail. Like with the 2 week on 2 week off study, they had like hundreds of thousands of dollars of studying. So what they did is every week before the diet break, what they would do is they'd retest their resting energy expenditure in the lab and be like, okay, this is how many calories they're burning at rest. We know they're doing this much activity throughout the day. This is how many calories you've got for your diet break.
Right.
Now that's great, but with my studies, I want the results to be applicable to athletes. Now, athletes aren't going to be going into the lab every 3 weeks to get their RMR tested. So I was like, well, it's not going to be perfect, but let's just use prediction equations, which any athlete or coach can use and see, okay, can we still achieve good results using this way?
Right. And I think it's this kind of thing where, it's just not applicable to think that everyone can go in and measure that. I didn't even know that you could measure it until now. It's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, MyFitnessPal says you're burning X. And would you say generally stuff like that's pretty unreliable? Like you wouldn't really, would you sort of say if you're eating 2,400 in your deficit, maybe you'd jump up 300 calories, maybe 500, something like that, maybe even 200.
Yeah, so I reckon, like, obviously I've got males and females in my study at the moment, and if you wanted me to ballpark the figure in how much their calories are going up from, because it's a moderate energy deficit, so like this is athlete dieting, so we know that you never want to starve an athlete. You don't want to take their calories too low because they can't concentrate. They get sort of increased perception of fatigue. Their training goes in the dirt. So it's a moderate energy deficit. So the calories aren't that low to begin with. But if I averaged out how much sort of calories the average person was increasing on their diet break weeks, it'd probably be around 400, 500 calories.
Right. Yeah.
And that increase in calories is coming purely from carbohydrate.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Is there a reason for that?
Yes. So we've got our 3 macronutrients. We know that if once you're at a sufficient level of protein intake, which in our study is 2.3 grams of protein per kilo of body weight, which is based on the research by Eric Helms and co, where they said, okay, what's the optimal amount of protein dose that someone should be taking in a caloric deficit? And 2.3 is sort of in that figure. So we decided to go with that. So once protein is established, there's no real benefit to having more protein. There may be some extra satiating effects, but the research is still a little bit unsure on that. And we know that when you overfeed someone on more dietary fat, that in terms of turning back hormonal downregulation, it doesn't really do much. We also know that when you increase someone's carbohydrate, we know that we restore muscle glycogen. And like we talked about before, when someone has more saturated glycogen, they're able to perform more optimally from a strength and an endurance perspective.
Yeah.
When you give someone more dietary fat, it seems to not really do anything for performance.
Yeah.
Like fat is is great for storing fuel, but as a fuel source, it's really not efficient.
Right.
Like carbohydrate is far more efficient. If you're doing any sort of activity that's at least at a moderate level of intensity, you're going to be relying on carbohydrate. So,
right. One thing I would like to segue into is obviously it's very fad right now, but keto. Obviously, if you listen to people like Joe Rogan, it's not the most reliable source, but a lot of people go on there and they'll say, oh, blah, 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 and he's very, very, very keto. Do you think there's ever a point in any sport where keto is a good option, or do you think it's just, for 99% of people, just pretty much useless unless you're trying to lose weight with a high BMI sort of thing? Or
I'd say one example in sport, and that's in ultra endurance marathon runners.
Yeah.
And the reason that it can be okay for them is because they're performing at such a low intensity in terms of sort of max effort. They're moving so slowly that they're predominantly burning fat as their fuel source. They're not drawing a lot of energy from carbohydrate, because what we know is as someone's exercise intensity increases, the percentage of fuel getting burnt from fat decreases and the percentage coming from carbohydrate increases. So with these ultra marathon runners who are running for days, they're running so slowly that their fuel source is deriving from fat. So yes, there could be potentially a benefit from going on a keto diet for them, which is going to allow them to preferentially burn more fat. But for any athlete who's, and I can almost say, like, I've looked hard at the research here, and I would almost conclusively say that for any athlete who's doing activity at least at moderate intensity or above, you're going to perform less optimally by doing a ketogenic approach to dieting than you are with a higher carbohydrate, moderate fat approach.
Right. I think, because I know with Chris Bumstead, he did keto in the last few weeks of his prep, but I think it was for a medical reason. I think, like, from what I've heard, it's pretty much useless for bodybuilding. And then you find a lot of people now are trying to peddle the whole, oh, do keto, get shredded, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm not sure if you know, I'll type it in chat because I don't want to start shit, but like this guy. You probably know him because he's from Australia. Did you know that?
I know him. I don't follow that dickhead though.
Yeah, no, I fucking hate him, mate. Honestly, fucking horrible. Like he's the plague of New Zealand, but it's fucked. But it's like people are starting to peddle that a lot, and it's kind of, I don't know. Yeah. Do you think there is a place for keto when it comes to like obese individuals?
So it's people are a little bit confused because what happened is there was some early ketogenic research where they took overweight individuals and pre-type 2 diabetic individuals, and they put them on a ketogenic diet, and they saw these really great results in terms of fat loss and sort of improving glucose tolerance and improving insulin sensitivity and things like that. So when these findings got published, people were like, oh my goodness, keto is so great for people who are insulin resistant and things like that. Yeah. But the problem with that is the benefits are mostly coming from just the caloric restriction itself as opposed to carbohydrate restriction, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because we've seen when we look at any review paper which is compared ketogenic versus sort of a more standard approach to dieting, as long as calories are matched between the two different protocols. Yeah. We tend to see no difference in fat loss whatsoever, and no differences in improvements of insulin sensitivity and things like that. So even with overweight people, I still think that the majority of benefits will come just from caloric restriction itself, and the way that they split up their macronutrient sort of intake within their allocated calories, I don't think it matters. Like have a decent amount of protein to sort of maintain your lean mass and facilitate adaptation from resistance training if you're doing that. But then with the calories left over, you should probably, like, unless you're a high performance athlete, where I think you should definitely be allocating more preference to carbohydrate intake. If you're just a general pop person, just split up carbs and fats how you like them. I don't think there's going to be any benefit to sort of having lower carb and higher fat, not at all.
Not when it comes to, because I've seen anecdotally people around me who've done keto. The majority of them who've done it have been usually overweight, and they've been just trying to lose weight. I found anecdotally that, especially one person I know, they found they are less inclined to overeating. Do you think that is a potential benefit, or almost placebo? Or
I think no, like not placebo. Like ketogenic diet, like you establish an energy deficit, you'll lose weight.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. But the keto can have some benefits because these carbohydrate, high sugar food, high palatable foods, things like that, they can be trigger foods for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So if someone's trying to sort of do a diet with sort of a high intake of carbohydrates, and they have a Rice Krispie bar, and then all of a sudden they want to eat 10 more Rice Krispie bars.
Yeah.
That can be the underlining of the dietary phase itself, not the actual carbohydrates. It's just they're probably overeating their total calories, and that's what's causing the problems. Like with a ketogenic diet, it's quite hard to sort of binge on sort of steak and butter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's just, I think you're less likely to overeat. And there is some research to suggest that that on a ketogenic diet, the hunger is not as severe. But I'm also a little bit inclined to thinking of that's just sort of a hedonic measure of the food, meaning like you're eating less pleasurable food, so you're less inclined to want to eat more of of the foods.
Yeah. Sounds it's a very, I think, interesting topic at this point, because my thing is I want to know, I would love to see research, I don't know if there's any, on people transitioning from keto back to a normal diet, or if they ever need to do that, because I think that's, like one of my friends who is on keto, when they get near carbohydrates, like they had a teaspoon of something, cheesecake something the other day, and it was just a teaspoon, and they got like wrecked. So it's like, okay, how do you even begin to transition back to anything?
This is one of the major problems with the ketogenic diet, is sort of the sustainability of it. Like if someone can't go keto for the rest of their life, which is extremely difficult, then you're faced with the problem of, okay, what do I do after I've lost my weight and I don't want to be keto anymore, and I want to be able to go and have a meal with my family out at a restaurant, something like that.
Because I believe the research is like 95% of people regain all the weight or something. Yeah.
That it's
not on keto, but on general diet.
Yeah, right? That's I was just going to say that's sort of general weight loss. But the unique thing about keto is sort of as you go keto and you become ketogenically adapted, your ability to tolerate carbohydrates in the future goes down. Yeah. So you're burning less carbohydrates. You get less efficient at utilizing carbohydrates. That's been evidenced in the literature. Look at, if people want to look up research by Louise Burke, who's an Australian researcher. She's done a lot of stuff on ketogenic dieting specifically for athletes. We know that you get far less adept at using carbohydrates when you go on a ketogenic diet. So what happens is when you transition to having a little bit of carbohydrate, or sort of a more sustainable, more moderate dieting approach after keto, your body just doesn't know really how to handle them. You can't burn them, and you often can't digest them as well. So what happens is people will go from keto to introducing some carbohydrates. They'll feel like crap, and they'll be like, oh, so keto's the way. And like that's why we have this massive, like so many keto zealots, is because people have tried keto, tried to go back to normal diet, felt like trash, and they're like, oh, so keto must be the best way. Yeah. It's like, well, if you never really went on keto in the first place, you'd probably be freaking fine. Yeah. If you know what I mean? Yeah.
I don't know. It's like, that's the thing. It's like, my thing is, I'm the kind of kid in class where I'm still at uni. I'm doing my bachelor's. And a lot of my friends are not very educated when it comes to nutrition. And like one time someone said something, for instance, around you can't lose weight on KFC just because it's KFC, right? Which obviously isn't true if calories exist and all that. But and it's like, I'm finding the general population doesn't seem to understand the basics. Even just carbs, fat, protein exist. And the fact that calories actually is literally the only way. Like, the other week I was at a party and some dude said to me, a caloric deficit is a pretty good way to lose weight. And I'm like, what the fuck did you say? Like, he literally said that and I like went off at him. It's like, fuck. And I feel like that is too common.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, yeah, I would love if that little basic piece of knowledge could get distributed to everyone, because it's like, for instance, the whole thing about people, I think people love to, get an excuse to the reason why they can't lose weight. And I think, I'm not very versed on this topic, but I think a lot of people use the excuse of metabolic damage or something. And I think I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe people have proven that's BS for the most part.
Yeah. With it's funny because they took a group of these people that thought they had sort of these energy expenditures that had been destroyed from previous dieting.
Yeah.
And what they did is they asked them how many calories they were eating and what they thought their energy expenditures were.
Yeah.
And then they went and retested it. They went and tested it in the lab. And they saw that their energy expenditures were actually fine. The problem was they were just underreporting what they were fucking eating. Like, a lot of people just don't, if they're not tracking, they don't understand how many calories they're eating.
No clue.
And when people are talking about they can't lose weight no matter what they try, it's usually just because they're eating more calories than they think they're eating.
Yeah. And it's like, it's sad that it's that simple, but yeah. Like, even for me, before I tracked any sort of calories, I currently don't track, but before I tracked calories, I had no clue. I couldn't even guesstimate anything. And then the moment I started tracking, I was like, holy shit. I thought I was eating like 4,000 calories a day, and I was more eating like 2,800.
Yeah.
So it's like, bro, that's a big difference. Where's that difference getting? Like, where's that coming from? Which I think is weird. And yeah, I think it's almost, it's sad because like the basics are so simple, but then, yeah, it's hard for people to grasp that. But yeah, I think we'll finish up here. But yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you? All the projects you're involved with, your research, etc., etc.
Yep. So I'm pretty active on Instagram. My Instagram handle is just @JacksonPeos. I keep up to date with some of I post up new studies that are getting published, and I sort of try to just take away sort of the practical elements of research, and I sort of just try and summarize it in sort of easily digestible manner for people to take away. And if you want to look at my research studies and keep up to date with sort of the research that I'm doing in the lab, you can follow my ResearchGate profile, which is just Jackson Peos as well. Anything that I'm doing in the lab or at university is published up there.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Student Side Hustle. I would appreciate so much if you would leave a review if you'd like to hear more of what I'm saying. Then I would love if you would follow me on Instagram or check out my other social media, all linked in the show notes. And again, I would just like to say thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful evening and study hard.